Good afternoon. Hello, I'm Susan Yaki. I'm the director of the La Follette School of Public Affairs here at UW-Madison. I'm delighted today to introduce New York Times journalist Eric Lipton. Eric's a three-time Pulitzer Prize winner who has recently been reporting on President Donald Trump's efforts to remake federal environmental regulations and policies. Lipton, who is based in Washington, D.C., reports on government relations, corporate agendas, and the U.S. Congress for the New York Times. He's visiting campus as UW-Madison's public affairs journalist in residence. I'm told we've been running him ragged, so thanks, Eric. Eric's 3 Pulitzer Prizes are for a diverse set of journalism. He won his first Pulitzer Prize in 1992, reporting on the flawed Hubble Space Telescope. Second, he won a prize for investigative reporting on how lobbyists influence congressional leaders and state attorneys generals. That was in 2015. As part of an investigative team that covered Russia's recent efforts in cyber warfare and cyber power, he won another prize in 2017. The Journalist in Residence programs are sponsored by University Communications, the La Follette School of Public Affairs, the Wisconsin School of Business, and the School of Journalism and Mass Communications, with support from UW Foundation and our Alumni Association. Eric's presentation today is also being co-sponsored by our Nelson Institute on campus, our law school, as well as our Department of Political Science. Please join me in welcoming Eric Lipton.
Thanks for having me here today and for having me in your beautiful city that I'm getting to know a little bit and hope to get outside a little bit more. They have been working me pretty hard, so I've been largely just walking from one academic building to another, and I have to get out and actually see one of the lakes at least before I leave, but I haven't had a chance to yet. And so I'm gonna sort of first take you through a particular story that I did earlier this year, and then discuss more broadly some other stories that I've done on the topic of the environment during the Trump administration, and then through that talk about what's happening at the EPA and what it's like to cover it, and sort of what the consequences are for all of us and society with some of the changes that are going on. So I mean, this is a photograph of me as in Tennessee earlier this year, and I'm essentially undercover at this moment because the rules of the New York Times are that we're allowed to go wherever we want, and we always have to disclose if asked who we are, but we don't always have to proactively say who we are unless someone asks us. And so in this situation here, I'm visiting the Fitzgerald glider truck sales lot in Crossville, Tennessee, I think it was. And Fitzgerald is a company that manufactures glider trucks, and glider trucks are these trucks in which they take old trucks and they take out their engine. They use their engines and they put a new cab around. It's called the glider because they buy the structure of the truck from the Freightliner, and then they drop in an old engine. And the reason they drop in the old engine is that these engines are before there were modern emissions controls. And so they are exempt from federal regulations regarding diesel emissions. And if you buy one of these glider trucks, you can spew particulates and nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide into the air at 35 to 40 times the amount that modern emission-controlled trucks do. And the EPA, the EPA has been working since the Bush administration, George W. Bush, for almost 20 years to try to reduce these sulfur and nitrogen and the particulates, which are a huge health hazard. The particulates get into your lungs. They can not only cause respiratory problems and asthma and respiratory irritations, but they're associated with chronic and at times even fatal conditions. And so it was during the Bush administration, and I talked to the EP, Carolyn Browner when I was working on this story, and it was actually during Bill Clinton's tenure that the EPA first started working on this, and they concluded that they were going to essentially establish new standards for trucks. And so that rule passed just at the end of the Clinton administration by the EPA, and then Crowell-Browner comes in, and she has to decide, do we want to roll it back? And they basically studied it, and they concluded that this rule was too important, and that they were not going to roll it back. So it's been 20 years that the industry has gradually been modernizing emissions controls on trucks, and I'm sorry that one's there. So, I began to look, but what happened was Pruitt comes in, and I'm sorry, 1 second here, and he meets, if you see there, with Tommy Fitzgerald. This is an excerpt from a Freedom of Information request. Pruitt is meeting with Tommy Fitzgerald there, and Tommy Fitzgerald is the chief executive of the company that I was on the lot of. He owns this company, and Fitzgerald was there to tell Pruitt that he should create this loophole to allow the glider trucks to be sold by the thousands, which would essentially undermine the 20 years and billions of dollars worth of effort to clean up diesel trucks in the United States. And so what I began to do is to examine, why would the EPA even consider taking such a step? Here they've spent 20 years in something that's been embraced by Democrats and Republicans, and all companies across the United States, UPS, all the fleet companies have basically replaced their fleets with much cleaner burning trucks. I'm speaking with fleet owners, and they were saying it used to be you couldn't even go into a garage where they were maintaining trucks and have the engines running because they were so dirty that you would cough and choke. But you look at a truck nowadays, if you know what it's like to be behind an old dirty diesel truck, and if you were to be behind a cleaner burning truck, it's a lot cleaner. You can just see it. It's the particulates. It's not that dark black smoke that used to come out of diesel trucks. So I began to sort of investigate, what explains this. And one of the things I noticed was Diane Black, who's running for governor in Tennessee. She's a Republican member of the House. Had gotten tens of thousands of dollars from basically everyone in the Fitzgerald family, and all of these LLCs that are associated with Fitzgerald, even though there's a campaign contribution limit in Tennessee of $4,000 for an individual and $11,700 for a corporation. But they had figured out a way to use every one of their LLCs to be writing, and every one of their relatives and all of their business partners to get all this money to Diane Black. And so I wanted to understand a little bit more about Diane Black. So Diane Black was very close with Trump, and Diane, you're great, thanks. And Pruitt, it's weird that these pages are merging together. Diane Black approached Scott Pruitt, the EPA administrator, and said, basically, I don't know that this is the words that she said, but I want you to do me a favor. I want you to create a loophole for Fitzgerald so that they can build more of their dirty burning diesel trucks. I don't know that that was the language that was conferred, but essentially, it's hard to understand why all of a sudden the EPA, because the EPA's own people in November 2017 had looked at these glider trucks, and they had concluded that the glider trucks were 43 times as high of particulate emissions and 55 times as high 43 times as high. The EPA's own staff did a study and found that that there were 40 to 55 times as high in particulate emissions than the modern trucks. So it's sort of like their scientists are telling them one thing, but the thing was that what I started to understand was that Tommy Fitzgerald had gone to Tennessee Tech and donated money to Tennessee Tech and got them to do a study, which they gave to Pruitt, which said, well, in fact, the emissions from these trucks are just as clean as the modern trucks. And there's Tommy Fitzgerald with the president of Tennessee Tech at a racetrack going to a game. And so Tennessee Tech was getting all this money from Tommy Fitzgerald, and look at his old buddy there. They're going to the NASCAR races together. This is the president of the university going to the NASCAR races with his donor, and then got a study done in his engineering department that said that the trucks are just as clean burning. And Pruitt then cited that truck in his notice to the Federal Register saying that we are going to nullify the ban on these glider trucks. So Pruitt sends a letter back to Tommy Fitzgerald in August saying, thanks for your letter asking me to roll back the rule, and I'm rolling back the rule, you know. And then Pruitt puts out a press release, and he says, you know, that we're going to do a new rulemaking in which we're going to allow many more of these glider trucks to be built. And I mean, you know, then they open the comment period, and so I mean, everyone from UPS to the American Lung Association is basically saying, what the hell are you doing here? You know, we just spent 20 years and billions of dollars in modernizing the entire United States fleets of trucks, and you're gonna create this loophole for these dirty burning trucks. Even the truck manufacturers, the major fleet owners, the American Lung Association, all the environmental groups. I mean, it was a rare consensus. I mean, it's rare to see the trucking groups and the environmental groups, you know, coming with the same voice. And this is one of the situations in which, for me as a reporter and covering the EPA, where I sort of like, where's the constituency? You know, it's just like most of the time, you know, if it's be it Democrats or Republicans, there's a constituency that you can understand, well, why is this change in policy occurring? In this case, I mean, this is a really narrow constituency. This is a single manufacturer in Tennessee this one company makes most of the glider trucks in the United States, but there are not that many trucks manufactured in the fleet trucks in the first place. So their capacity was great enough that they could actually make have a significant impact. There's someone that did an analysis for me that said that it's like many times these trucks were going to create more emissions than the entire VW scandal that the EPA and the Department of Justice had just collected billions of dollars in fines from VW, and this was going to be like something like 10 times the amount of air pollution from this rollback, which is, again, like, I can't understand it. You know, what's the explanation for this? And so it ended up being a story of how, you know, $225,000 in campaign contributions can secure a loophole from the EPA. And in fact, on Pruitt's last day, after he's essentially been fired, I got a call from the lawyers who were suing the EPA over this, and Pruitt had issued essentially an executive order instructing the EPA enforcement people, because he was not able to finalize this loophole, to instructing the EPA enforcement people to not enforce the ban on glider trucks. And then the new acting director came in, Wheeler, and he actually reversed that. But it was just, I mean, to me, that was, that's an example of, you know, be a Democrat or Republican, it's a case that I just have a hard time understanding the rationale for that. I mean, this is another example. If you can read this one on the left, the EPA staff recommended that a particular pesticide called Chlorpyrifos, which is one of the most widely used organophosphates, which is a class of pesticides that is a neurotoxin, and it attacks the pest. But the problem is that they imply it with helicopters and planes, and the farm workers and their children is a neurotoxin to them too. And so the EPA staff evaluated Chlorpyrifos and concluded that they could not say, and I'm sorry it's so small, but they could not attest to its safety, and so therefore the registration should be revoked. But in March of 2017, after Pruitt, and just like I saw the calendar entry with Pruitt meeting with Tommy from Tommy Fitzgerald, Pruitt met with the pesticide industry and the agriculture industry. He then moved to reverse in March of 2017 the ban on Chlorpyrifos. And so Chlorpyrifos is still on the market in the United States, although there's been another lawsuit over that, and the EPA has now been ordered to revoke the Chlorpyrifos, but they're appealing it. It's pretty incredible to think that the EPA is going to appeal to the Supreme Court for permission to continue to allow the use of a pesticide that's causing developmental disabilities in children. But imagine the Department of Justice making that argument to the U.S. Supreme Court. But that's where they're headed, is to try to go all the way to the Supreme Court with this. I mean, you know, it sort of, you know, goes on from there. I mean, there's a story there about Scott Pruitt going to a basketball game in the University of Kentucky with seats provided by Joe Kraft, who's the CEO of Alliance Coal, and Pruitt was Alliance Coal had been a major contributor to Republican Attorney General's causes when Pruitt was an Attorney General, and Joe Kraft is a personal friend of Scott Pruitt's, and he invited Pruitt and his son to go to a University of Kentucky game. That's the guy with the glasses is Joe Kraft, to go to a University of Kentucky game with him and his son. And then Pruitt is sort of one after another is moving through the regulatory priorities of Joe Kraft to revoke some of the regulations on coal. And I mean, leaving the EPA and looking at the Department of Interior, I went down to the first one. There was a story in Lexington, Kentucky. I went down to Louisiana, and as I mentioned in some of the journalism classes, I actually chartered a boat and went out into the Gulf of Mexico with a photographer, and we did a story about the companies that are doing production in the shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico, and many of them own very aging platforms that were first built by the Exxons and Chevrons decades ago, and now they're owned by smaller companies that none of us have ever heard of, and many of them are very financially challenged because they're mostly producing gas, which isn't producing very much revenue for them, and they're very financially challenged, and many of them have serious safety issues. And these are the same companies that were intensely lobbying Scott Angell, who himself is a former oil industry executive and now runs the agency at the Department of Interior that oversees safety and environmental protection at the Department of Interior for offshore drilling. And they were lobbying Scott Angell to roll back the rules that were just finalized in the aftermath of BP. And so the rules that are intended to prevent another catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico have now been weakened. Just that last week, actually, they finalized the revisions of that rule. And so I was down in Louisiana writing a story about how the same players who have some of the worst safety records have successfully lobbied Scott Angell and the Department of Interior to roll back the post-BP safety and environmental rules. The story about the guy who runs the Air and Radiation Office, that's Bill Wareham there, and photograph. Bill Wareham, in November of 2017, he only started recently. He was confirmed pretty late. He was still representing all the biggest coal-burning power utilities in the United States as their lawyer, and he had like dozens of lawsuits pending against the EPA, challenging the regulations and the Clean Power Plan, the Mercury Rule, the new source review, and then he's confirmed by the Senate, and he immediately goes in and becomes the head of the Air and Radiation Office at the EPA, and literally, I mean, he took his lobbying to-do list, and then he began immediately to roll back the rules that he had been lobbying as a lawyer on behalf of the industry for the last several years. And one after the other, he has now rolled back most of the rules that many of the rules, including the Clean Power Plan, that he had been hired by the industry to try to go after in court, and he had been unsuccessful at killing. But now he runs the agency's air program, so he has a lot more power to actually execute on his clients' desires. And we also have looked at the enforcement side and how there's been a significant decline in enforcement by the EPA, both in terms of the number of cases they're initiating and the penalties that they're providing to companies that violate the law, and also to the amount that they demand the companies spend to retrofit their power plants or their hazardous waste incinerators or their steel mills in order to correct the pollution that causes the violation in the first place. And the EPA says that what's happening is they're transferring authority to the states, as part of what they call cooperative federalism. I'm going to soon be examining that question as to just how much of the states actually picking up the ball as the EPA sort of defers to the states, and whether or not the states are actually assuming that role. And what I found in last year when I looked at this was that at least in this community in East Liverpool, Ohio, that had not happened. And in this community, there was a hazardous waste incinerator on one side of town that was violating its air permit. On the other side of town, there was a warehouse that had magnesium that was letting the magnesium go into the air, and magnesium causes, again, developmental disabilities in children. And these things were sitting there with no enforcement by the EPA for a number of years. And there was an example of the decline in enforcement. I mean, this has only been sort of part of the story, and the thing that has been, in addition to writing stories about policy and substantive changes in regulatory policy, we all along we've been writing stories about ethics, and the ethics story as of like April of 28 this year really sort of went crazy when it was actually ABC News that first reported that Pruitt had been living in this condo in Capitol Hill for $50 a night, and that the condo was owned by a lobbyist and his wife, and so the first thing they said, of course, when it became public through ABC News, which did a great job getting the story first, was that Pruitt and both Pruitt and Steve Hart, the lobbyist, said, well, we're just old friends. I know him from Oklahoma. We have no business before the EPA. I've never lobbied Scott Pruitt. I've never lobbied the EPA since Pruitt became the administrator. So that was what they said, and then everyone FOIA'd the Freedom of Information Act, the emails of any correspondence between Steve Hart and the EPA, and what do we find? Oh, geez, I thought I was highlighting it, and I wiped it out. And what do we find? But Steve Hart is writing here it is. He's writing the chief of staff, Ryan Jackson, who is Pruitt's chief of staff at the time, asking him for a meeting with Coca-Cola in this instance, and then later then I did it right the next time. Then he's emailing Steve Hart there, is confirming a meet and greet with Administrator Pruitt on behalf of Smithfield Foods, which is the largest pork processor in the world, he met with them on behalf of a pipeline company, and it just these emails came in, and I kept calling Steve Hart's spokesman. I said, and the guy's like, oh my God, it's Eric again. It's like, this guy Ryan, I forget Ryan's last name. He's like we call it Flack. I mean, he's like a spokesman for, and it's like I said, Ryan, just like whatever there's out there, just give me all the emails now, because it's like this drip, drip, drip. I mean, how many times are we going to find out that Steve Hart was actually meeting with Pruitt and appealing to the staff as a lobbyist? This is ridiculous. Just get all the emails and give them to us. And he was like he couldn't believe that, and it ends up Steve Hart resigned as chairman of this lobbying firm, and this was incredibly embarrassing, because they had basically both been, I mean, lie is a pretty strong word, but they had been misleading to us, and suggesting that there was no that Pruitt there was no business relationship. In fact, this guy was lobbying Pruitt and Pruitt's agency on a whole bunch of issues. And that was just, the start of it. Then we learn that Pruitt is asking aides to. This is now Pruitt's Sidney Hoop, who was an executive assistant to Pruitt, was emailing Chick-fil-A to try to get an appointment for Pruitt to talk to the CEO of Chick-fil-A to get his wife a franchise. And because Pruitt was financially challenged, because he is in a cabinet with all these billionaires like Wilbur Ross, and he's making his $200,000, and he's got one kid in law school and one kid is an undergrad back in Oklahoma, and a wife and family that's got a house in Oklahoma, and he's in D.C. and he's feeling strapped. So he asked his aides to help find his wife work. I mean, that's a violation of federal law. You can't have, federal government officials intervening with the CEO of a corporation to get a franchise, a Chick-fil-A franchise. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, so, I mean, as this stuff started to emerge, I mean, Pruitt, I just couldn't, I mean, even people who are Republican lobbyists in Washington that I talked to, we were all just like, I mean, what is going on here? I mean, this is just crazy and so irresponsible and actually stupid. I mean, Pruitt had ambitions to run for the United States Senate, to run for governor, even people talking about him maybe running for president. And he's getting his aides to contact Chick-fil-A CEO on behalf of his wife. And so, I mean, at a certain point, Trump really loved Pruitt, because Pruitt kept putting points on the board with all these rules that he was rolling back. And, they could have a lot of press releases, and it helped, gain support among the business community that saw all these rules going down. But at a certain point, the White House staff was just so fed up with this ethics stuff that Trump let him go, and basically instructed him that he needed to resign, and he resigned. So I mean, Sidney Hupp, and she's gone too. I mean, all of his people have went back to Oklahoma with him. And so I think that that none of this is, for me, is partisan. I mean, as I've explained to some of the classes that I've been in the last couple of days, I covered the Obama administration, and I wrote at the time about how the Obama administration was essentially conspiring with the environmental groups to try to get things like the Waters of the U.S. rule pushed through, even though there was heavy opposition from the agricultural community because they thought it would have too costly of an impact. And so I'm all about finding people that are manipulating the system to their own advantage and exposing it through transparency and through public documents. But I mean the thing that just sort of strikes me is like on particularly the glider rule is is the question of what's the constituency. It's like that's the thing that I really have a hard time understanding. I think that actually Andrew Wheeler, who is the new acting administrator, he has a very similar beliefs on regulatory policy that Pruitt had, but he's being much more methodical about how he's going about in the brief period of time that he's been there, how he's going about moving to repeal rules, and he's actually going through the required steps that are under law that are necessary. To repeal a rule, you need to go through what's called the Administrative Processes Act, requires you to actually issue a new rule, and that could take multiple years to do a new rule. You can't simply say we're not going to enforce, like Pruitt did, we're not going to enforce the glider standard. You can't do that. That's illegal, and you get told that that's an arbitrary and capricious act because a federal rule is therefore must be enforced. And Wheeler so far, Wheeler, when he saw that action by Pruitt to say we're not going to enforce the glider ban, what they actually did is they only allowed these companies to manufacture 300 units per year, because the glider still has somewhat of a useful purpose in the situations where if you basically have bought a new truck and then you have an accident and the engine of the old truck still works, you can pull the engine out of a relatively new truck and put it into a new chassis. And so therefore these companies are still allowed to make up to 300 gliders per year, because there's a certain number of accidents that occur, and you don't want to have to throw out a good engine on a major 18-wheeler. But Wheeler took that non-enforcement thing and he threw it out. So far I see Wheeler still is intending to reverse the Clean Power Plan. He's making some changes in the Mercury rule. He's making changes in the Waters of the U.S. rule. But he's doing it in a more thoughtful way, and you can disagree or agree with his policies, but he has not been as the actions have not been as inexplicable as they were under Pruitt. But we're continuing to watch. We're focusing in particular now on the Department of Interior and policies relating to public lands. The United States government controls much of the West. It owns much of the West, and there's 700 million acres of land that the United States government, which is multiple times the size of Alaska, that the government owns. It owns much of the state of Nevada. In states like Utah, it owns almost half of the state of Utah, and a lot of that land is leased out for oil and gas production. And coal production, and the policies in that space are changing really quickly right now as well. And so there's a lot to track with respect to the environment. The policies regarding endangered species are changing. Policies regarding toxic chemicals and pesticides, air and water, all these things are in play right now at a pace that we've not seen since the birth of the EPA. There's never been a period where more rules are in play simultaneously than I think really, even perhaps the Reagan administration. And I guess you could argue to some extent, the opposite was happening during the Obama administration. And it's one of the things that I've talked about as well in some of the classes that I've been at this week, is that part of the reason that we are going through this period of transformation in the EPA is that Obama, in his second term, was so frustrated with Congress that he basically said, you know what, I'm going to use the power of the pen through executive order to remake environmental policy in the United States. And he started to issue order after, through the EPA and the Department of Interior, they enacted more new regulations in environmental space than any probably administration in many years. And so many of the rules that are being rolled back are those same rules. And Obama, used his executive powers out of frustration with Congress to an extreme. And we are in the midst of a backlash against that. But some of these things, like the glider rule, goes back. It's not just a matter of Obama. This is something that's been underway at the EPA for 20 years. So the Trump administration is going even farther than simply trying to negate Obama's legacy in terms of environmental policy. And so at the New York Times, we're committed to covering both the news stories of these changes and to do the investigative work to explain who are the parties that actually played a role in these reversals. It requires a lot of labor. There's a lot of document collection, interviews, travel around the United States. I've been all over the country reporting these stories in Montana and Wyoming and in Ohio and Illinois and in Louisiana and Tennessee. I mean, those are just the places that are coming to mind that I've been to recently. And I go out. I mean, I build databases from federal information. I collect documents. I do interviews, and then I go out into the field to tell the story through real places and real people. I mean, these are things that have real consequences for everyone in this room. I mean, the toxic chemicals that you can go to your Home Depot or Lowe's or your local hardware store and buy. There's things on the shelves there that the EPA knows are likely toxic and should not be for sale. And they are going through a process right now of trying to evaluate a lot of older chemicals that have been for sale for many years. And that process is being significantly influenced by people who just left the chemical industry and have been appointed to senior positions in the EPA. And similarly with pesticides, the government is now going through a process of reevaluating organophosphates, which are the same. Chlorpyrifos is one organophosphate. And every 20 years, because pesticide understandings of what our understanding of science changes so much with pesticides that the Congress passed a law that requires pesticides to be the term is it's not essentially recertified, but that's not the legal term that they use. But every 20 years they have to be recertified, and if they're not recertified, they can no longer be sold. And we're coming up on the 20-year anniversary of the last time that organophosphates went through this process, and so it's a very critical moment. And Danny Heikem and I, who's a colleague at the Times, Danny went out to Salinas for a story we did together, Salinas, California, where it's the most heavily used place in the United States for organophosphates because it's like the salad bowl of the United States. There's so many vegetables that are grown in that part of the San Fernando, how do you pronounce it? San Fernando Valley, that area in California.
San Joaquin.
Yeah.
San Joaquin Valley.
Okay, is so productive, and California actually is the only state that requires disclosure of every gallon of these pesticides, so that we were able to gather data and see we could look by field as to how much of the organophosphates have been used. And every time you use an organophosphate, and you have to geolocate its use into a database, and California monitors it. And so that was a level of data that we were able to study. And there's also some really intense studies involving the epidemiology of the exposures to children and the developmental disabilities that those children have who live in areas with extremely high organophosphate use. And so what we found was that the EPA, they have this thing called secret science rule that they're trying to push through right now, which would largely prevent the EPA from using, it appears as if it may prevent them from using any of these epidemiological studies that have concluded that there's a correlation between organophosphate exposure and childhood developmental problems, because the epidemiological studies have data which is confidential and can't be released. So the secret science proposal would therefore exclude them from being considered. And so that basically will allow these pesticides to get re-registered because you no longer have evidence that they're causing health problems. And so when we were working on that story, one of the interesting things was I was looking at some of the people who are questioning the epidemiological studies, and I was doing some searches on the internet, and I found that these documents from the tobacco industry from a couple decades ago, and they used the same exact language when they were trying to challenge the studies on secondhand smoke. And they used the terminology of secret science and the need to make sure that the data was made public and available. And all these documents, because of litigation with the tobacco industry, became public, and they're on file at University of California at San Diego or San Francisco. And so it's some of the same people that are now involved in being paid by the industry to fight the pesticides are using the same exact language. It's as if they took out, secondhand smoke and they put the word in, for pesticide. And it's just incredible to see that, the echo of the same tactics that are being played again. So this is all stuff that I feel is really important. And if Trump can call us fake news and do whatever he wants and accuse us of having some, agenda. But to me, it's all about transparency and making sure that the public at least knows what's happening, and that you can decide what you want, but the public has a right to know how these things are really happening. Because if we only write about the fact that the Trump administration announced today that they are repealing the Clean Power Plan, then you don't really understand the backstory. And the New York Times can do both. We can tell you both the news and the backstory because we have the resources and we're committed to making sure that that we're fully informing the public about what's going on. So that's what I do, and for the foreseeable future, I'm going to be continuing to write about Trump regulatory policy, and we have a lot of people working on it. So I think that I'm going to probably stop and take some questions.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for being willing to take some questions too. We have till 5:30 together, and we have two folks that are going to be running around with mics. Please don't ask your question until you get mic'd. We're doing some recording of today's event. So, Eric, we'll let you call on folks.
Okay, go ahead. Yep.
Hello, great talk. So we've covered the very, very silly of backdoor bartering, so to say, between money and policies. What are your thoughts on much more heartstring pulling bartering? So for example, you talked about Joe Kraft of Alliance Coal?
Alliance Resources.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
So for example, he funded a public math and science academy in Eastern Kentucky that lets kids who probably wouldn't go to college otherwise go to college. Or there's the Reclaim Act that was largely proposed by Mitch McConnell on taking money away from mine reclamation pools of money into disadvantaged communities. So we have these really hard ethical questions of these people are doing dishonest things, but they're hiding it behind well-intentioned actions. So what are your thoughts on those?
I mean, there's no question that Joe Kraft has been incredibly generous with University of Kentucky in particular, and he has built, a bunch of facilities there, and he's revered in Kentucky because of his commitment to the university. There's multiple buildings that are named after him. I don't question that he's committed to his, the university that he attended and that helped him, learn and become a successful business person. Some of the changes that they're making with respect to coal burning power plants, something called the effluent rule, which regulates water emissions from electric power plants, not just coal burning power plants. And the EPA passed a language change that prohibits toxic metals from being emitted into streams and rivers from power plants. That makes a lot of sense. You don't want toxic metals like arsenic and mercury going into rivers and streams. It kills the fish, and it also can contaminate drinking water. But the EPA's moved recently to, so far, for 2 years, suspend the implementation of the effluent rule. It's also, it's changed the coal ash rule. So that, we just had in the hurricane, and some of the coal ash ponds were breached. And the EPA spent years, after a decade ago, there was a coal ash catastrophe in Tennessee, and they spent years building a new coal ash policy. And that the EPA has just gone and revised that coal ash policy to delegate more authority to the states. Each of these are, in terms of air pollution, There's something called the new source review. They've significantly changed the new source review. The Clean Power Plan they've changed. They're making changes down the Mercury Rule. These were all items on Joe Kraft's agenda list, and also Bob Murray from Murray Energy as well, which is another major donor. He made $1 million contribution to Trump's inauguration committee, and so but again, it's another question of, well, what's the constituency? The number of coal miners in the United States is like smaller than, a few auto manufacturing plants in the United States. I mean, it's, I'm not trying to be insensitive to the coal mining communities and the people that work there, but it's a very small number of people that actually work in the coal mining industry. In the state of Kentucky, there are probably more people that work and make manufacturing automotives than work in coal mines, because they've got some major car manufacturing facilities in Kentucky. And the natural gas is now, a better price. And for utility ratepayers, you're better off having natural gas power than coal power. So it's like sort of, what's the constituency? It's like, whose interest are they pursuing here? Even if you want to try to for the major energy producers like AEP and Duke, I mean, they don't necessarily want the Clean Power Plant gone. They have built this into their bottom line. So anyway, I'm sort of diverting from your question. I guess I look at, I'm not, a person can be incredibly generous, but they can at the same time have influence with federal policy in ways that I think at a minimum should be brought to light. And that's my job, and that's what we've done. So there's two mics, or there's one mic? Okay, so let's see. Yeah, go ahead. I get in the front row here.
Yeah, I came in a little late, so I don't know if you've covered this. Is anything being done to recoup the losses or mis-expenditures that were made by Pruitt and his harem of 2 or 3 female assistants who were grossly overpaid, and also his abuses with travel and other things? Anything being done along those lines? Thanks.
Sure. There are some ongoing investigations by the Inspector General. I don't know what the result of them will be, and so far there's been nothing, and I wouldn't be surprised if it just sort of goes away without any follow-up. The Inspector General is supposedly an independent part of the EPA, but I haven't been particularly impressed by their willingness so far to really challenge, and I've been particularly unimpressed with the ethics office at the EPA and its willingness to stand up against some of these things that were so clearly violations of federal ethics and federal law. So there's little incentive for the Trump administration to pursue this very aggressively. So, I think the answer is unlikely that there will be, certainly not any compensation, and it's an open question whether or not there will be even any formal action, and we don't know yet. But if it happens, we'll write the stories. Why don't we go over here? Sorry, that's sort of hard for you to get to.
Currently, until the end of the month, EPA is hearing testimony on ACE, the clean energy replacement to the Clean Power Plant. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering about process right now. Mm-hmm. Is there any chance that, regardless of what kind of testimony is given, that it has any sway?
Yeah, I mean, the way that the federal rulemaking process works is that Wheeler now is in charge of the EPA, and so they are going through a formal process to essentially replace the Clean Power Plant. So part of the law requires them to have public hearings and to take public comment, and they're doing that. And the law also requires them to take those public comments into consideration before they issue a final rule. So whatever public comments are provided, it's a pretty laborious process, but they will have to evaluate them. And then when they issue the Federal Register notice at the time the rule is finalized, they will address the comments in general terms, but it's unlikely, to be honest, that they have a policy objective, and whatever their policy objective is will likely be the end result of that rule. And so the thing that's really going to decide it is litigation, because there clearly are going to be lawsuits over this, and the question is whether or not the EPA is sufficiently moving to limit carbon emissions and climate change. And because there was a court decision in Mass versus EPA that essentially resulted in carbon being considered a pollutant, because previously the EPA did not regulate carbon. I mean, it's not like carbon monoxide or particulates or sulfur or nitrogen, because carbon dioxide itself is not harmful to our health. It's a pollutant only in the sense that it's a contributing factor to climate change. So now that the courts have decided that CO2 is a pollutant, and so therefore the EPA is required under law to regulate it as a pollutant. So whether or not the ACE is sufficient to regulate CO2 is a matter that's going to be decided by the courts. And so that's why what happened last week with the Supreme Court is so critical, because not only has Trump been moving very aggressively to appoint two Supreme Court, but the Court of Appeals and federal district court judges, he is probably going to make more appointments to the federal court system than any president in several generations, and it's a combination of reasons. You had a generational change going on among a lot of judges. We're reaching retirement age. It's just something that sort of cyclically we've gotten to a place where there's a disproportionate number of judges in the federal system that are at retirement age. You also had McConnell in the Obama administration, who not only held up the confirmation of the Supreme Court justice, but who was intentionally not confirming all kinds of appeals court and district court vacancies. And so when Trump's term started, there was a very large number of vacancies in the federal court system. And so the two things that the Trump administration has been most efficient at is regulatory changes and court appointments and confirmations. And the Senate has been moving very aggressively. There's been more than 60 appointments to the Federal Court of Appeals that have been confirmed. I mean, it's a really large number, and there is more change going on in the federal court system right now than there has been in many generations. And so this is a change that's going to, and Don McGahn, the counsel, the White House counsel, is intentionally picking people who are in their 40s. And so they will be there for 30 years unless something else happens to them. And so what happens to the Clean Power Plan is most likely going to be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's why for environmentalists they were so focused on Kavanaugh, because Kavanaugh is known to have been frequently taken positions on environmental issues that were more industry friendly than environmental friendly. So it's consequential. We'll go over to this side. Yeah, go ahead.
Secretary Pruitt also recommended a 30% reduction in EPA's budget, and I don't think it ended up that way. But then the other impacts are to staff, senior scientists. If you could comment on that, maybe the concerned scientists survey of scientists.
Yeah, I mean, just like there happens to be a generational thing going on in the federal courts, even more so at the EPA. And the EPA was created almost 50 years ago. And there are lots of people at the EPA who've spent their entire careers there who are at retirement age. And so the agency is massively losing, through natural retirement, really large numbers of people. And at the same time, the Trump administration imposed a hiring freeze at the EPA. So the EPA is now down to the lowest level of employees it's had since the Reagan administration. And in addition, they're replacing, they're not filling science positions, and they're not filling like a science advisor. There was just a woman that runs a child health program that was put on administrative leave, and they say for legitimate reasons, and we still don't fully understand why. So they're talking about changing the regional office arrangements and changing the powers that the regional offices have. So, I mean, they're making structural changes at the EPA that are pretty consequential. But, I mean, when I speak to a lot of EPA career people, and these are people, who have worked through Republican and Democratic administrations. I mean, they have their own personal views, but they're civil servants who have been there in many cases for decades, and they remain committed to, interpreting the law, and gathering data and making regulatory decisions based on the data and the law, and they'll outlast the Trump administration. And so the most consequential things are the rulemaking and the court actions, because once the rules are in place and the court upholds them, that combination of two things is quite consequential. Go ahead. We go here. Yeah, sure.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I'm a liberal, so I might have heard what you said. I might have heard it wrong, and I might have twisted it. But you said that the changes that the Trump administration is making to some of these regulations was a response to Obama's executive orders. And I'm just wondering, was there would you say in your mind, a quantitative or qualitative difference in the way those decisions were made from one administration to the other in terms of the use of science? So basically what my impression would be that the Obama administration would have used their scientists to create the policies, but the examples you've given from the Trump administration have been that they have used politics and money to change those policies. So I'm just wondering if you could comment about whether there's a difference or not, or whether it's just I'm living in a liberal fairyland.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that you could answer it either way, and that's not particularly helpful. But I think that both things are sort of true. So the first answer is that like when you look at the cost-benefit studies, and most rulemaking in the United States requires a cost-benefit analysis, and you have to have a benefit to society before you can pass a rule, because why would you pass a rule that brings less benefit than its cost? And so since the Clinton administration, there's been a particular requirement of a net positive benefit. But the reality is that you can tweak the cost-benefit analysis. I mean, you can tip the scales, and both sides tip the scales. I mean, and the Obama administration did it in a very big way, and they distorted the benefits in ways that pissed off the regulated industries, and they sued over that. And the Trump administration is doing the same things, and it's like they're both cooking the books when it comes to the cost-benefit analysis. And I was just in Flint, Michigan this weekend. There was a Society of Environmental Journalists. It's the first time I went to it because I'm not really an environmental reporter. I'm an investigative reporter, but I'm writing about the environment this year. And so I went to the Society of Environmentalists meeting, and they had it appropriately in Flint, Michigan. It's not a particularly luxurious place to be. There's no junket in Flint. My bosses cannot complain that I was in Las Vegas partying it up. But I met there the Minnesota pollution control. It was quite interesting. There were some EPA officials there. There were state officials there. And I was asking a Minnesota official about PFAS, which if any of you have heard of PFAS, it's a chemical that's unfortunately been found really broadly in drinking water supplies across the United States. That it's the same thing that the Teflon and Gore-Tex, and it's this incredible chemical that DuPont created that repels water, and it also is used most broadly in firefighting because it creates a barrier, and so it puts out a fire. You just simply spray it, and it's like the fire goes away. It's a fire retardant. And so in military bases and at airports around the United States, they've been using crazy amounts of PFAS for decades. And it's now in drinking water supplies across the United States. And it has significant health consequences. And the EPA is now in the process of deciding what is a drinking water standard for PFAS. And it's a huge decision because that whatever level they decide is dangerous is going to mean that municipal water companies across the United States must meet that level. And then they're going to have to spend whatever money is necessary to meet that level. And that means, potentially billions, or I don't even know, trillions of dollars in expenditures to clean their water supplies or to find alternative water supplies in order to meet that drinking water standard. And so anyway, this all comes back to your question. I was asking, and I was talking to the Minnesota, guy, pollution control guy, who incredibly is both his own well is contaminated with PFAS. And because he lives near 3M. And he was telling me about how devastated he was when he learned that his well was contaminated with PFAS, and his children had grown up in his house drinking his waters, and he still doesn't know what the consequences are for his now grown children, and he's also the state regulator who's like trying to figure out what to do with PFAS, But he was telling me that it's a matter of economics, politics, and science. All these decisions we're just trying to balance. That society can only afford certain costs. There's always a cost benefit. So I guess, but that's my one answer, and that was a really long one. On the second part, I'll give you a shorter answer. The second part is that I do think that the Obama administration, by and large, was more rigorous with its science, and I did not find examples of them essentially taking the Tennessee Tech study funded by Fitzgerald and putting that in the Federal Register as a partial justification for and what was a corrupt study. And that study, Tennessee Tech, after my story came out, there began an investigation of that study. They then sent a letter to the EPA asking the EPA to withdraw the study and to not consider it in any regulatory decisions because of concerns about the corruption of the academic process, and it involves the president of the university in ways that could result in problems for him. I didn't see stuff like that happening during the Obama administration, so I think that both of them are tipping the scales on the cost-benefit stuff. But I think in terms of the pure science, I see more evidence of manipulation in the Trump administration. So that's a long answer. I guess we'll go over to this side.
We have time for one more question. And let me tell everybody that there's going to be a reception after. We hope you'll join us.
Do the guy behind you. Sorry, because I think it was,
This isn't Saudi Arabia, of course, but as an investigative reporter, revealing the illegal actions of powerful people and interest groups, are you ever concerned about your safety?
I mean, when I worked at the Washington Post before I was at the New York Times, and I remember I was writing about poultry farms and water pollution from poultry farms, and I was with Michael Williamson, a photographer from the Washington Post, and we were driving together, and we were sort of visiting some of the poultry farms and observing, the practices that were causing pollution and actually resulting in water pollution that was coming all the way down the Potomac to Washington. And I mean, this is really minor, but the poultry farmers were so mad that they chased us through the mountains, in our car. It was like a car chase through the mountains. What we decided to do is we looked up the closest police station, and we drove to the front of the police station, and then they stopped chasing us. But I mean, I often encounter situations that are hostile. And people that are angry at me personally because of what I represent, the New York Times, and Trump has certainly contributed to that in a very big way by the whole enemy of the people, which is really hurtful. And there's in our offices, we just completed construction on bulletproof walls and glasses in our office at great expense. We now have huge bulletproof doors, and we have an armed security guard at the entrance to our office now for the first time that is there at all times. And they're even having, sometimes, recently, they're even there on the weekends because they thought maybe someone would somehow get into our offices. I mean, and so, yeah, there are concerns about, our security. And I just got in my email, if we're, the requirements about, it's not very reassuring, but the New York Times, when we take certain trips, is now going to get certain insurance on us. To compensate for our deaths and our losses if we're injured while traveling for work. And we just got an email that we need to start notifying them more about our travel, not for budgeting purposes to limit our ability to travel, but just for notification purposes so they can take out insurance policies for us. So, I mean, I personally it doesn't affect my reporting. I'm careful. And I don't travel. I do travel some overseas for the paper, but I'm not a war reporter, and so I'm not going. I sit next to Eric Schmidt, the guy in my cubicle right over from me. He covers ISIS, and I mean, when I look up and Eric Schmidt's not there, next thing I know, he's in Niger, or he's literally embedded overseas and out in the desert, and tracking down ISIS cells that are still there, and so there are people in my office who do very dangerous things, much more dangerous than I'm doing. And the paper is taking greater precautions to try to protect them. But it has not impacted, our willingness to go out and do the story. But it is something we're thinking more about. So I guess we're out of time.
I think we're out of time. Please join me in thanking Eric Lipton.